We are now going to our last session for this Georgetown Africa Business Conference. So Zianda, in the morning we had Dr. Antoinette as our keynote speaker. And this evening we have a very other special guest keynote speaker,
Yes.
Travis Adkins.
Exactly.
And, you know, just please let us know more who Travis Adkins is and why he is our keynote speaker.
So I always say before I read bios, not only are these bios robust, you guys need to show me energy. So when you're impressed, say, wow. You should feel the bios as I'm reading them, please, because this keynote speaker is extremely distinguished. So, ladies and gentlemen, next we have a very, very special guest to present one of our keynote speeches, and he will be wrapping it up for us. So please be warm, come with the energy and the love. Mr. Adkins is the 10th president of USA Development Foundation and the CEO. Wow. Previously, he served as Deputy Assistant Administrator for Africa at the U.S. Agency for Development, the USAID. As an international development leader, he has over 2 decades of experience working in governance, education, humanitarian affairs, and women's and youth empowerment in over 50 nations throughout Africa. Wow. And Middle East. Wow. This includes serving as staff director of the House Subcommittee of Africa, working in leading international NGOs and think tanks, as well as several branches at the United Nations system. He is an alum at the International Affairs Fellowship at the Council of Foreign Relations, a former senior fellow of African Program at the Center of Strategic and International Studies, and a recipient of academic appointments from Carnegie, Mellon, and New York universities. Mr. Adkins has served in numerous international election observation missions in Africa and the Middle East with National Diplomatic Institute. He is a regular contributor to national and international media outlets on African affairs and is a life member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He holds a master's degree in international affairs and education from the New York School and Lehman College. He is also a graduate of Fisk University. A Leonard man, wow. This is one of the nation's historically black institutions. So that's lovely, isn't it? Please join me to warmly welcome Mr. Adkins.
Good evening. Can you guys hear me pretty well? Fantastic. As I was standing in the back, the only thing I heard was the illustrious name of the HBCU from which I graduated. Maybe dangerous to say on the campus of Georgetown University, but that is my home, and I'm so happy to be here at Georgetown, which of course I think many of you will know is also a home for me. I've been a lecturer in the African Studies program and also the Security Studies program for the past 5 years, and so very proud to be here amongst you. I think the first thing I would want to do so as not to disappoint my mothers who raised me is to thank all of you so much for the time and your presence and your listening ears this evening, but also to the organizers whose brilliance, whose commitment, whose long nights, I'm sure, and early mornings made this entire week possible. And so if we could just take a moment to acknowledge them, the students from Walsh and McDonough who made this happen. On the point of pride, let me just say, as one who has committed his life and work to the elevation of the standard of living for African people and their diaspora, I couldn't be prouder to be the president and CEO of the U.S. African Development Foundation. For those of you who don't know it well, I wanted to share a few of the elements that make it a particularly unique agency in the U.S. government, specifically in the world of foreign assistance. I think that you all know that sometime around the murder of George Floyd, we started to hear an uptick in academic and policy circles about this notion of decolonizing foreign assistance. As it turns out, there were several members of Congress who 43 years ago had a similar idea. And they created an agency to help to deal with that. And they decided to call it the U.S. African Development Foundation. The three key things I think make us the most unique is one, we are the only U.S. foreign assistance agency that is solely focused on the continent of Africa. So many will have an Africa division or an African department, but our whole agency is focused solely on the continent. The second is that we invest directly in African entrepreneurs and African enterprises. There are no intermediaries, there are no middlemen. We're not funding an NGO in Washington that's then going to Africa to show somebody how to do anything. The third piece is that 100% of our staff across the continent are African nationals of the countries in which they live. We do not use expatriates, and this provides us with many advantages over many of our brother and sister agencies. First, of course, is that no one knows their nation better than the people who live there. No one knows their culture better than the people who are a part of it. And so the keenness and the insight that we have puts us above and beyond many of those who work in a similar space, because what it means is we can work in places where others might be too fearful to go. We can work in places without the fear of evacuation because the people who work with us as partners are already home. And their understanding of the social and the political and the economic geographies of their nations is one of the things that allows us to serve people who otherwise might go unsupported. The other thing I wanted to say about our agency is the way in which we prioritize partnership and collaboration. And so any nation in which we work, we're partnering with the national or the subnational governments, communities in those nations. And so there is no sense in which we show up to tell people what to do. In fact, the way that our model works is we show up asking people what they already are doing and how we might make technical assistance or economic investments that could support that work. So in a very real way, there is an innate belief in the genius and the ingenuity and the vision and aspiration of African people. And only what I like to say to them is they're not helping us with our work, we're helping them with theirs. Another part of this is that our partnerships also take place along the lines of partnerships with interagency, other partners in the U.S. interagency, USAID, MCC, DFC, and others. But also we have exciting partnerships with the African Diaspora Network based in Silicon Valley, with the NBA Players Association Foundation, where many of the most exciting athletes and entertainers in the world are engaged from the African diaspora, from the continent of Africa, looking for ways to link back to their home countries, looking for ways to serve. And on the final point of pride, one of the things that connects us all together, and I know that this week there have been those who have spoken about diaspora, and I should say that wherever I go, I say without apology that I am proud to be one of the sons of the 12 million Africans brought to the United States and to all of the Americas against their will, to be the bearers of burden for the creation of the economic foundation of the most economically powerful nation in the history of the world, and their ability to overcome all of the adversities that they faced to make sure that their children could live in a dignified way in America and throughout other parts of the world in which they were taken away from our beloved continent. And of course, this history has parallels in the relationship between European nations and African nations, which we see in everything from fights over museum artifacts that have been stolen over centuries to fights over migration and belonging. And so, even though I won't teach a class on that this evening, I thought it was important in a conference where we're talking about the future of Africa to connect it to the past, to connect it to the present, because there really is nothing new under the sun. Much of what we will discuss and has been discussed this week are things that if you go back far enough, there were Pan-African Congresses, there was the Organization of African Unity, there was the founding of the African Union, where they were discussing some of the same challenges that have dogged us because of what history has relegated or sought to relegate the Africa region and its people to. And so one of the things that I wanted to mention in that regard is that obviously scrambles for Africa are not a new thing. We know that they happened in the past. We hear about kind of great game competition and scrambles for Africa even now, and we probably should expect that those will go into the future. But what I wanted to begin our conversation with tonight is what we have been discussing this week, and that is the ways in which African people can be the proprietors of the health and the wealth and the innovation that derives from their own genius. Everybody globally has recognized that we have it. Many have sought to obtain it. Few have wanted to pay for it. And that is what has put us in the situation in which we find ourselves trying to climb out of today. And so it is a great irony of history that one of the wealthiest one of the wealthiest regions of the world, some of the most creative people in the history of the world are under a narrative of poverty, are under a narrative of conflict, are under a narrative of not having enough to sustain themselves. And so to my mind, that discussion for us this evening has to begin with the demographics of the continent. The United Nations reports that by 2050, the populations of more than half of Africa's 50 nations will double. That means the continent will become home to 25% of the world's population. These estimates are based on current birth rate data, which project that African mothers will give birth to 500 million children from each decade from now until 2050. So this tells you immediately the import of women, not as the producers of children alone, but as the central fulcrum by which the continent will grow, by which children will come to life, by which they will understand what their responsibilities are, by whom they will have their needs met, and by whom they will seek the guidance and wisdom to become productive citizens. And so it is clear what our priority should be in terms of the demographics of the continent. If you listen enough in Washington, you'll get the sense that women and youth are this big blob because people never mention one usually without mentioning the other. Obviously, there are women who are youth and youth who are women. But the main thing for me is that that conversation typically trends towards speaking of these groups as small, niche, special interest groups, or almost as if they are minorities, when in fact, the data is just the opposite. And what you have in the continent's women and youth are marginalized majorities of people. And imagine the state of affairs when that is the way that we look. I don't know how many of you saw the kind of class picture that was taken by the African leaders at the end of the Africa Leaders Summit. But it had all of the heads of state from the continent. Hardly anyone in that picture under the age of 65, and only one woman, of course, the president of Tanzania was there. And so that image is the direct opposite of what the continent is in its daily demographics, in its aspirations. And so to the extent that we don't make pathways for the majority of the population, we run the risk of increased instability and a lack of economic growth. I like to say that nations cannot rise any higher than the status that they provide and allow for their women. And there can be no economic growth in a sustained way across the continent without the equitable inclusion of women in economics, in labor, in law, in politics, as decision makers for their nations, for their people. The other thing is a quote from the great Nelson Mandela, who says, "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children," which I would expand to be read as its youth writ large. So on a continent where over 50% of the populace is women, and more than 60% of that same populace is under the age of 25, we should dispatch with these notions of small special interest groups and realize that that is where the game is for the future of this great continent. Having established the centrality of women and youth for a prosperous future on the continent, we should do the same for the continent's small and medium enterprises. Globally, SMEs account for between 80 to 90% of all businesses and up to 50% of its jobs. On the continent, they also account for 80 to 90% of all businesses, but a whopping 80% of all jobs, contributing somewhere between 20 to 35% of the continent's GDP. And so that is where almost the entire game is. With an estimate of 44 million such enterprises across the continent, it's clear that SMEs are the central driver of Africa's economy, and the women and youth who employ them and run them and lead them should be central to all of our focus, as they are for the work of the U.S. African Development Foundation. These truths, though, I would say are often obscured because I think in business schools, in media, and so forth, there is this kind of obsession with unicorns, right? Which are essentially enterprises that reach a $1 billion valuation without going on to the stock market. Obviously, those are few and far between. In our schools of policy, when we look at nations and where they rank, there is this, I think, overemphasis on GDP. Certainly, it is one measure of a nation's success, but it does obscure the lived reality of millions of people because it doesn't give you an indication of the distribution of wealth in a country. It doesn't give you a picture of the inequality in a nation. And when you don't have attention to that, this is where you can get problems that move beyond economics into political stability, into conflict, into civil war, into outflows of refugees or economic migrants, and the like. And so it is central, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because economy obviously is a central node of the health of any nation. And this is why we tragically see what is happening to economic migrants from the African continent, so desperate that they cannot find ways to eke out a livelihood in a sustainable way in their own countries, that they seek ways to escape. And this is why we see our people dying, trying to cross the Sahara, being detained and abused in detention centers in North Africa and even Europe. And I would say most tragically, dying in the Mediterranean Sea. As the author Nanjala Nyabola mentions in her book, Traveling While Black, that the Mediterranean Sea in the modern world is the largest mass grave site for Africans on the planet. And all of this because we cannot get strong economic engines that can engage our women and our youth and give them the opportunity to live the kinds of successful lives that they would want to create. And I came up with just 5 quick reasons for the importance of SMEs beyond the broad strokes which I have shared, and I will go through them fairly quickly. First, of course, is the SME's capacity for job creation, which I've laid out just a few moments ago. Second is their role in innovation, right? That innovation is often happening at the margins of a society, right? Innovation is the mother, or excuse me, invention is the mother of necessity, right? People who have the ability to solve problems on the outskirts of the mainstream that often allow themselves or their societies in many ways to leapfrog. And so this is a space that we ought to be investing in. Of course, their role in poverty reduction and increasing incomes in local rural communities and often urban ones as well. Obviously, the role that they can play in the economic growth of a nation. If 90% of all businesses in a given region or country are small and medium enterprises, then that is where the game is to create the rising tide, to lift the greatest number of boats. And the last one, of course, is the role that SMEs play in export and trade from the continent, with 80% of exporters in Africa being the proprietors of small and medium enterprises. And so there is work that has to be done to realize the potential of these SMEs. And I was just go through a few of the things that USADF is doing in that regard, and areas of focus that I think all of us would do well to prioritize. The first is the limited access to finance that African SMEs are able to have. This is one of the reasons that USADF focuses on grant capital investments directly to small and medium enterprises. Often these investments give them the ability to purchase equipment, to get warehouses, to store food that may have been lost, to get other kinds of critical infrastructure or transport and trucks to be able to move their goods. The other piece of that work is the technical assistance that comes with it. This is about bookkeeping, financial management, the digitizing of of financial information that can help these entities improve their credit worthiness and move beyond the scope of grants into the world of commercial loans, which many of them are seeking to achieve. The second, which I also included a little bit in that first one, is again the lack of infrastructure. The biggest of those for USADF is really off-grid energy, right? And not just lighting up people's houses so that they can see or have entertainment or that their children can study, but also energy at the nexus of healthcare, energy at the nexus of agriculture, energy for the purpose of doing business and increasing incomes. The third one is the limited market access that many of these folks face because of their location in rural and remote areas. And so we work to try to connect them to markets in their local, regional, and sometimes national context. There is a focus for us on small and medium enterprises that focus on value addition, value addition, value addition. As many of you will know, there's a long history on the continent under the colonial context of kind of monocultures, of economies producing only one thing in a raw material form, exporting it out, and then buying finished goods in their home nations made from the raw materials that they gave in the first place. And so we're looking to work with communities and invest in entrepreneurs who are doing things in a different way, taking a pineapple and turning it into 7 different products, taking maize and doing the same, millet and sorghum and doing the same. And just to give you an example of this, because the continent is still a net importer of food, even though when you get there, you haven't seen a place where the sun shines like it shines in Africa. You haven't seen the kind of fertile soils that you see in Africa. And in many of the countries where we work, you also have rich water resources. And so you would ask yourself, why would we be importing food when we have the capacity to grow it right here at home? And so when on a recent visit to Cote d'Ivoire, there's a farmers cooperative group that we work with that had not been able to produce rice, and they were importing it from China, and under COVID and with problems in the shipping lanes, they were no longer able to get it. And so we look and say, how can we move people from food security to food self-sufficiency? And so what these farmers decided to do was to grow their own rice. And we made a few investments in them to build out their equipment and their warehouses. And when I visited them, they took us into the rice paddies. They took us to the milling facilities. They showed us their packaging facilities where they had themselves begun to do something that they could have probably been doing for 60 or 80 or 100 years already, but are now, because of the complexities of the global market, getting the idea to do it themselves. And that is the way in which we try to operate. Additionally, there's limited business skills amongst some of the folks with whom we partner. And so again, we're looking at ways to help them build their capacity, connecting them with local businesses, doing work in vocational training and job creation that will help to resolve some of those problems. One of the stickiest ones for us, of course, is the regulatory and policy environment, which we cannot control. And this is about government, and this is about advocacy, and this is about civil society and looking for ways to get nations to open up in such a way that will promote an enabling environment for small and medium enterprise owners. A couple of other things I'll speak about is, of course, the challenge of climate change. This is something I saw most recently on a trip to Senegal. I was in Saint Louis, and there was much talk about saving Saint Louis, the beautiful World Heritage Site, protecting the infrastructure against the rising sea levels, all of which are beautiful, all of which are necessary, but none of which meet the challenge of what is happening to the people and to their livelihoods. And so as climate changes and fish stocks begin to go further out to sea, fishermen have to go further out to sea. Then you face the challenge of international illegal fishing. And so one of the most ironic things is that the fishermen would be going further out to sea and coming back with nothing. But because of rising sea level, the sea would then come in to the land and take away everything. And so we saw many communities where homes had been washed into the ocean. And when you see it, it's awe-inspiring in a negative way. It's palpable in a negative way, but that's just the structure of the building. What you don't see when you're there is the members of the family who also got washed out into the sea, the grandmother that you can't find, your children that you don't know where they are, your husbands and spouses and so forth. And so we're doing work there to look at how we can help people to rebuild livelihoods in the wake of climate change and in the wake of a changing environment that does not allow them to maintain their traditional ways of sustaining themselves. Because another problem posed by climate change in terms of rising sea level is that when the ocean comes into the land, it goes back out, but it deposits salt into agricultural lands. And any of you that know anything about farming will know that you cannot grow produce in salted lands. And so these are just some of the ways in which that challenge is attempting to be addressed. Obviously, we know the controversy that the continent has contributed the least to climate change and yet suffers the most from its impacts. And so we work in ways that we hope can mitigate that. And so the core message that I have for you all, which you already know, but I use it as a rallying cry in a moment like this, is that the investment in the human capital of the continent is the fastest and best way forward for the prosperous Africa that we hope to see. Obviously, education is critical for economic growth. Healthcare as a component of human capital development. Skill development in terms of being a driver for innovation. Public and private partnerships to promote human capital development. investing in women and their health, as I mentioned earlier. These are all core elements of that. And so one of the things that we talked about during the Africa Leaders Summit of the Biden administration, and that many of you followed closely, was the idea of partnership. And for too long, I think Africa has been seen as a region of beneficiaries, as a region of people who need help, when the fact of the case is that African diasporans in their remittances to their home countries are giving more every year than all of foreign direct investment, are giving more than all of official development assistance. And so it gives the lie to this notion. And what we want to promote is the idea of African people and nations as partners in this work, who know their world and know their environment and know their needs better than anyone else. And so we also look at that, and through that lens, regional and continent-wide collaboration. So a lot of the work we support is in cross-border trade, is in infrastructural kinds of developments that will support trade between nations of the continent, but that will also support export to national markets. And so many of those who have received investments from the U.S. African Development Foundation, you can go in Walmart and Target and Whole Foods and Yes Markets and Trader Joe's and see their products right on the shelves, because they have been able to jump over the barriers that kept them from meeting the international standards and from being able to do that kind of work. And so with that, I will close my commentary with a note of thanks and with a call to action for all of us to believe in the capacity of ourselves and the great people from which we have come, and to use this time to develop the ideas that you have to serve in any capacity that you choose, not forgetting that the everyday people need you more than the high and mighty, and that all that we can do to make an impact on the largest number of people will be the way forward to harness the great potential of the continent that we know through history and that we hope to see going forward into a bright future. Thank you guys so much.
All right, guys, we're going to have a few closing remarks from our co-chairs, that is Nee and Ruth Ochonma. So please, before you leave, we just want to give a program after here. And Ruth, Nee, you know, say something? Yeah. And by the way, just, you know, earlier when I mentioned that this year's Georgetown Africa Business Conference had 11 sponsors, and I told Zianda and the audience that my favorite one was the Georgetown Africa Business Conference planning team. And I couldn't have asked for a better team to be a part of. And all that you're seeing right now is thanks in large part to the conference, to the team of the GTABC and our lovely co-chair. So Nee, you're most welcome.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you guys for that warm reception. Definitely want to close out, continue on what Travis said. Just what I took from it is a call to action. You know, these talks have happened, like you said, when, you know, ECOWAS was formed, African Unity was formed, but we need to put action to it. So when Ruth and I thought about, you know, bringing people together, and the conference has now been in person for 2 years. So we sat back, you know, back in December, we went to the US Africa Business Leaders Summit. And then we thought about, you know, how can we, you know, continue this conversation? And today we're here where we're talking about issues like this. And the call to action is really what we want to hone in on. What is the diaspora doing with the future of Africa? We're going to be the largest population coming in 2050 or 2030. We can do something. You can pick one child, you can pick 5 people and just invest in them. And that's where it is. So I just want to close out to say, you know, the main thing here is taking in information and also making connections with people. You know, talk to people who have the same like-mindedness like you have. You know, discuss ideas, but most importantly, put it to action. So I want to thank you, Travis. I mean, this was so inspiring. We couldn't have asked for a better closing remarks or closing keynote than this. And I'm walking away taking what you said about, putting things into action in my mind as I graduate in a couple of weeks. So I want to thank everybody. Yep. So thank you guys for coming. So next up at 8 o'clock, we'll be meeting at 2115 Wisconsin Avenue. Same place for our event yesterday for our gala. Just to wind down, enjoy some good African food and some drinks, and continue that networking session. The conversation continues there. And we all celebrate. Thank you for everything.
We should wait for the official report to come because this is going to be in waiting. Okay. Yeah.
It don't have to be my picture. I'm just saying. Yeah,